Every empire tells the same lie, that it will last forever. The Ottoman Empire controlled trade, land, and armies across 3 continents, and still its economy began to fail. Not suddenly, quietly, in the coin, in the taxes, in the system itself. And while most people trusted the empire, the smart ones were already moving their wealth into just 4 assets the system could not destroy.
Every empire looks permanent until the money stops working. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire controlled trade routes, taxed vast agricultural lands, commanded armies across 3 continents, and ruled one of the most important cities on earth, Istanbul. From the outside, it looked too large to fail. But that is the illusion every declining system creates, because economic collapse rarely begins with one dramatic event. It begins quietly, in the coin, in the tax system, in military spending, in the state's need for cash. And by the time ordinary people realize what is happening, wealth has already started moving. That is what makes the Ottoman story so valuable. Because when the Ottoman economic system started failing, the people who protected wealth did not rely on optimism. They did not trust the state's promises. They did not assume the old order would fix itself. They moved into assets the system could not easily destroy. And if you study the pattern carefully, 4 forms of wealth stand out again and again. Not because they made everyone rich, but because when money was debased, taxes became heavier, wars disrupted trade, and the state reached deeper into society for revenue. These were the assets most likely to hold value, preserve income, or remain useful when paper claims and political confidence started breaking down. To understand why these 4 assets mattered, we need to understand what was actually going wrong. The Ottoman system was never just bad management. For centuries, it was highly effective. The empire collected taxes through a layered provincial structure, drew strength from agriculture, customs revenues, and long-distance trade, and used coinage not just as money, but as a symbol of sovereignty. In its stronger centuries, that system was flexible enough to finance expansion and maintain order across an enormous territory. The real pressure began when military costs rose, wars intensified, old revenue structures weakened, and the state needed more cash than the old order could reliably produce. One turning point came with major debasements of the Akçe in the late 16th century. Later, from the late 18th century into the reign of Mahmud II, the empire experienced some of the fastest debasement and inflation in its history. That meant the same nominal money bought less, price stability weakened, and trust in local currency became harder to maintain. Then came another layer of fragility. By the 18th and 19th centuries, repeated wars, disruptions to trade, fiscal stress, and growing integration into a European-dominated world economy changed how wealth operated inside the empire. By 1854, the Ottomans took their first foreign loan. By 1875, the debt burden had become so severe that the empire suspended payments, and in 1881, the Decree of Muharrem created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, effectively assigning key revenues to creditors. That is not just a debt story, that is a sovereignty story. When a state starts losing control over its currency, its taxation, and eventually parts of its revenue stream, the question changes. It is no longer what is the best investment. It becomes what can still survive political and monetary stress. The first asset was the oldest one in the world, gold and silver. Not theory, not ledger entries, not promises, metal. When empires come under fiscal pressure, one of the oldest responses is debasement, reducing the precious metal content of coinage while keeping its face value alive by decree. The Ottoman Empire did this more than once, and every time the currency was weakened, people had to ask the same question people ask in every age of monetary instability: what is real money now? This is why specie mattered. When confidence in the state's coin eroded, people did not become less interested in money. They became more selective about which money they trusted. Research on the 17th century empire shows that debased European coinage circulated widely in Ottoman markets during a period of monetary instability and shortage. In other words, when domestic monetary credibility weakened, substitution followed. People moved toward the forms of money they believed would actually hold value in exchange. And it was not only merchants. Probate records across the Ottoman world showed that estates often included jewelry, precious metals, coins, and objects whose value could be weighed, appraised, and transferred. Studies on Ottoman estate inventories and women's material wealth showed that jewelry was not just ornament, it was portable value. It was status, liquidity, and protection at the same time. That matters because portability becomes a hidden premium during instability. A house can be taxed, a farm can be raided, a business can be disrupted, a promise can be broken. But gold worn on the body, hidden in the household, or held as coin remains outside many of those risks. That did not make it perfect. Gold produces no yield. It can be stolen. It doesn't help you if you need a steady income and prices keep rising. But as a store of value during debasement, bullion and high-value silver objects solved a more immediate problem. They escaped the unit itself. And that's why physical precious metal sits at the top of this list. Because when the unit of account begins to fail, the first line of defense is the asset that does not depend on the credibility of that unit. The second asset was property. Not any property, urban real estate with use, location, and cash flow potential. Shops, warehouses, multi-room houses, buildings near commercial activity, property linked to rent, storage, transport, or neighborhood demand. Why did this matter? Because in an unstable monetary environment, income-producing property can reprice. A coin can be debased in an imperial order, but a well-placed building in a major city still has utility. Someone still needs to live there. Someone still needs to store goods. Someone still needs a shop front. Utility doesn't disappear just because the treasury is under pressure. This is not speculation. We can actually see the importance of housing markets in Ottoman records. A major study of 2,246 house sales in 18th century Edirne found that house size, proximity to the commercial center, and access to fresh water mattered for value. The same research also found that inflation-adjusted house prices fell sharply after the Russo-Turkish War of 1768-74, showing that even strong assets suffer in crisis. But that is exactly the point. The best property did not protect wealth because prices always rose. It protected wealth because it remained legible, usable, and tradable even when the macro system deteriorated. There's a deeper Ottoman angle here too. The empire had a long tradition of waqf endowments, and in Islamic legal tradition, the waqf structure gave certain assets a degree of protection because endowed property was not simply disposable like ordinary private wealth. Britannica notes that waqf property traditionally enjoyed a form of inviolability. It could not simply be sold to pay debts or repurposed at will. That doesn't mean all waqf property was a private safe haven. It wasn't. But it does show something important about the Ottoman world. Assets connected to durable legal structures often survived better than purely nominal claims. So the lesson is not houses always go up. The lesson is sharper than that. When an empire weakens, the most resilient property is property with three things: location, legal recognition, and recurring use.
because when money becomes less trustworthy, society starts valuing assets it can still physically occupy, rent, and defend.
The third asset was productive land. Again, not romantic land, not empty prestige land. Productive land tied to crops, livestock, rents, or tax rights. The Ottoman economy was deeply agrarian for most of its history. Agriculture was not a side sector, it was the fiscal base. Taxes on the countryside, agricultural production, and the movement of goods were central to how the imperial machine worked. So when the state needed more money, pressure often returned to the land. Over time, especially in the 18th century, tax farming and the Malikane system allowed rights to revenue collection to become increasingly valuable. Provincial notables, ayan, and other local elites were able to accumulate influence through tax farms, landed estates, and control over agricultural surplus. Research on the Malikane system and on landed estates in regions like the Balkans shows how economic power increasingly clustered around those who controlled rural revenue streams. This is one of the most important patterns in late imperial decline. When central states weaken, productive local assets become more important. Why? Because food demand is inelastic. People can delay luxury purchases, they can postpone construction, they can reduce consumption of imported goods, but they still need grain, they still need oil, they still need animals, they still need access to land that produces the basics of life. That gives productive land a different kind of resilience, not because it is immune to war or taxation. It is not. Land can be devastated by conflict, disease, labor shortages, or confiscation risk. But relative to purely monetary wealth, productive land gives you something more durable, a claim on real output. And in periods of systemic stress, real output matters more than paper valuation. This is why so many elites across failing empires drift toward the same logic. They want not just wealth, but controllable necessity. Land that produces food is not merely an asset. It is a hedge against scarcity, inflation, and state disorder all at once. The fourth asset is the most misunderstood. It was not just trade. It was access to external networks, foreign-linked commerce, and claims denominated outside the empire's weakening internal system. As the Ottoman Empire became more integrated into European trade and finance, another reality emerged. Some of the best protected wealth was wealth tied to the outside world. European merchants and trading companies came to dominate large parts of trade with Europe. Capitulations, originally granted under conditions of Ottoman strength, later became channels through which foreign merchants and protected interests gained major advantages. Why did that matter for wealth protection? Because when an empire's internal currency weakens, its debt burden rises, and its institutions lose bargaining power, external claims gain relative strength. A merchant with access to foreign silver, a financier linked to international creditors, a trader whose cash flows come through export channels, a business operating under legal or diplomatic protections stronger than those available to ordinary locals. These positions were not available to everyone. They were elite positions, but that is exactly the point of this video. In every weakening system, the people closest to hard currency and external settlement mechanisms gain an advantage over the people trapped inside the deteriorating domestic unit. By the late 19th century, this became impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire's foreign debt crisis led to default in 1875 and then to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, which took control of assigned revenues for creditors. At that stage, foreign financial claims were not just safer than many domestic claims, they were literally embedded into the empire's fiscal machinery. That is the final stage of monetary hierarchy. First, people distrust small units of coin. Then they prefer metal. Then they prefer productive assets. Then, eventually, capital seeks the jurisdictional edge. Not just a better return, a better legal environment, a better settlement system, a stronger claimant position. In late Ottoman terms, that often meant the people best connected to foreign commerce, creditor structures, and external money were far better insulated than those whose entire balance sheet remained purely local. So, when the Ottoman economic system started failing, what protected wealth? Not slogans, not loyalty, not official reassurances. 4 things stood out. First, physical gold and silver, because they escaped debased money. Second, urban real estate with rental or commercial utility, because use value survives monetary stress. Third, productive land, because necessity keeps paying even when confidence fails. Fourth, foreign-linked commercial and hard currency claims, because external settlement becomes more valuable as domestic credibility collapses. And the deeper lesson is bigger than Ottoman history. Empires do not usually collapse all at once. They decay in layers. The coin weakens, the tax burden shifts, military pressure rises, credit expands, foreign leverage grows, and wealth begins separating into 2 worlds. The wealth still trapped inside the system, and the wealth already positioned outside its weakest points. That is why this history still matters, because the Ottoman Empire was not poor in the simple sense. It was large, strategic, resource-rich, politically sophisticated. And still, under enough fiscal strain, even that system could no longer protect everyone equally. It protected the prepared first. And that's the pattern history keeps repeating. When a financial order begins to fail, the winning question is never, what is everyone saying? It is, what still holds value when trust breaks? That was true in the Ottoman Empire, and it is still true now.